And if you see the extreme attempts, and it is mostly that most of the experiences of the writers get reflected in their works, and that is the reason knowing about the background and the life or the biography of the writer would certainly be useful, and especially it is more true in case of Louise Glück. And when it comes to Louise Glück, she had a wonderful family background where father was a postman and mother was a homemaker, and she was very much interested in art, and father was a musical critic. A wonderful combination it is. And probably that is what makes Louise Glück more sensible and more intense in her expressions. It is because her father was writing doggerel verses, and mother was very fond of art, and surprisingly, unsurprisingly actually, uh, probably Louise Glück picked up both poetry and art, and she found both these areas helping her to express, but later she took more to poetry rather than leaning on art. And Louise Glück, from at the very early stage, she learned to write. That's very, very interesting thing. At the age of 4 or 5, she shares her experience when it says that at the age of 4 or 5, she started reading literature. That's so amazing. That's so surprising. And she started reading like a blog by William Blake and other writers. It is because there was an exposure. With her sister, she explored a number of works, and bedtime stories fixed her imagination, where the journey into the world of imagination and the journey into the world of mythology, that gave her a lot of creative dimensions for thought. And she started writing very early, she admits, and her father would feed them with illustrations. And it is a wonderful collaborative production at the very early age, even before she was 13 or 14. She started producing her poems with the help of mother, father, where mother would paint for her illustrations and the father would print them. And that had been collaborative production. And she submitted a first book at the age of 13 or so, but it was rejected from a magazine. But she continued sending her poems, and later she stopped sending, but people started asking and picking her poems from different sources and started publishing them. So that is how the journey was. And here I would like to draw our attention to one important thing, where how important it is for children to have some example within the family, where we ask our children and we blame most of the youngsters for not having inclination for literature or reading or some kind of thing. But do they have that circumstance? Do they have that ambience at home where they take to these kind of things? What we need to think of. And Louise Glück, she read A Little Black Boy without any historical background, but she was able to sense the pain. And throughout the poetry of Louise Glück, he said, the heavy pain, and that's the reason Dr. Ram on readers, because there is nothing artificial. Even though there is imagination, it is blended with reality in most of the poems of Louise Glück. And when she read William Blake time and again, and she says she has read many a times William Blake and other writers, including Shakespeare, where she by hearted most of his verses and enjoyed the poetic creation. But at the same time, she had her own doubt, like what purpose do they serve in a play? And when it comes to William Blake, she read it many a times, and she says she not just read his literature, she heard every cry that is hidden in each of the poems of William Blake. And later she was engrossed by Roman and Greek literature, where the father was very fond of reading such things and as bedtime stories. He narrated number of these stories. Mother narrated number of stories, and also the grandmother narrated these stories. W.B. Yeats, Wordsworth, Emily Dickinson. So all of this gave her a kind of collective experience of the whole field of literature, and that took her forward. But at some point of time, especially when people arrive at their teen age, there are many distractions. And in a country like America, we can imagine what it is. And there, she wanted to be an actress, and she wanted to be applauded. And when she wanted to be applauded, she wanted to be a performer. But the thing is, the greatness lies, or the success lies in a person when we realize our limitations and strengths. And that realization came to Louise Glück when she wanted to be a performer. And rather, instead of I explaining what actually made her that realization and understand her limitation and strength, let us listen to Louise Glück herself. Let me watch a small video.
It was one of those sort of child dreams that oftentimes gets knocked out of the child and replaced by something else, sometimes something equally grand. From the time I had that little poetry competition in my head between Swanee River and Little Black Boy, early, always I knew that what I wanted was to write, and I digressed occasionally. There was a period in which I wanted to be an actress, which I later realized was simply that I wanted to be applauded. I had no gift for theater at all. I had good memory. I could memorize lines, but I was very poor performer. I was cleaving so hard to an evolving self. The idea of subordinating that self to a role was completely impossible. So my mother, with whom I was often at war in that period, kept saying, "Darling, darling, it's such a shame you want to be an actress because you're such a fine writer and painter." And she left the rest unsaid, and that made me more stubborn. But that was very brief. And then I went back to what I dreamed of. I mean, I didn't know what you did to become a writer with a book, but I wrote poems from the time I was in my early teens. I submitted my first book when I was 13 or 14. Of course, sent back, and poems to magazines. And I persisted.
Yes, and then life is not a bed of roses. It's not always a happy journey, as we know, and it is more true in case of Louise Glück. Her teenage had been a period of suffering and cocoon life, and it is an unimaginable suffering, probably when we peep into her life. When she was in high school, that she entered her teenage, she had anorexia, a lack of appetite, and which continued for almost 7 years, because of which she had to give up her high school. She had to stay at home, and for 7 years, she imprisoned almost in a room. And her body was totally different from others, but she decided to be abused. This period of suffering, especially in the teenage, made her understand many realities. Realities related to the reactions of the family members, and in most of the poems she expresses it. Although we call her a straightforward writer, a very reflective expression of her teenage experiences of suffering have been articulated in a very reflective way. And gladly, she found a psychoanalyst who helped her overcome her challenges. For 7 years, she was at home, and later she goes to college in Columbia, Lawrence College and Columbia. There, it's all the miracle of teaching and teachers. And there she meets wonderful teachers who are her mentors too, Leonie Adams and Stanley Kunitz. These two individuals make her what she is. She herself confesses. And Leonie Adams soaked Louise Glick in poetry workshops. She took her to most of the poetry workshops and asked her to recite her poems and listen to others and find what exactly she would do in the days to come. And Stanley Kunitz continued that. And in her college, she started earning for her expenditure. She worked as a secretary to be self-dependent, and later she joined Goddard College to teach. And what she learned from her mentors, she passes on the same to the younger generation. It is, even today, she loves to read and guide young writers. And it's said that she has written forwards to many promising young voices. She prefers not to be a poet within quotes or ism poet, like existential, feminist, progressive. She doesn't want to be branded under any one of that, but she blends reality, nature, mythology, imagination in unique proportions. And her contribution to poetry, as mentioned earlier, she has published around 12 anthologies, and now it is 13. And her contributions to other genres of literature is also there. And we have got a few omnibus editions of Louise Glick and chapbooks and prose collections too. And in addition to that, prose collections, she has also written a few criticisms which have been published in some of the major magazines. And major themes of Louise Glick are autobiographical, confessional, reflective to evoke sense and sensibility, blended with reality, mythology, and nature. And disappointment, rejection, loss, sense of isolation, these are all the recurring themes of Louise Glick, and basic concerns are betrayal, morality, love, and sense of loss that accompanies it. She is at the heart of a poet of a fallen world, is the remark made by Stephen Burt. And although we say confessional writer, we have a few confessional writers from India too, especially Kamala Das. Kamala Das is almost too open in her confession, but when it comes to Louise Glick, she is a highly balanced, reflectively confessional writer. And with all these themes in her works, throughout we can see these themes continuously recurring, and she representing most of her life and thoughts and experiences rather than a lot of imagination or a lot of creative other exploration. She explores language and creation in thought, but when it comes to emotions, she leans on to experiences of life. And as already mentioned, and the Google gives us all those lists, she has won a number of awards and rewards for her literature and individual books, and her collective poetry has got a lot of recognition. But I would like to draw your attention to one of her own remarks a few years ago, where regarding winning without race, she says, "It's very difficult to win. It's not in my script," Louise Glick said. But she won Nobel. And probably it is time for me to conclude, where to conclude, I take resort to her own lines. "I think here, I will leave. I leave you. It has come to seem there is no perfect ending. Indeed, there are infinite endings. Or perhaps, once one begins, there are only endings." With that I conclude, but I think this should open a few more doors for us to explore more and more of Louise Glick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gururaj. That was a very elaborate peep into her academic career and her writing career. I'm sorry about the connectivity that I suffered earlier, but we're going to invite the questions at the end of the session, which is after the three speakers have spoken. And now I invite Dr. Bhumika Sharma, who is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Central University of Rajasthan in India. Her research interest includes gender studies, Indian English literature, post-colonial literature, and African American writing. She is the author of the African American Journey to the Power Dome, Wright, Ellison, and Baldwin. She has co-authored 2 books. She's a very prolific researcher and has around 35 publications as research articles and book chapters in various anthologies and journals. I think something of remarkable interest includes her article in the literature published by Sahitya Academy and Journal of African American Studies published by Springer, USA, and Epiphany, Journal of Transdisciplinary Studies published by International University of Sarajevo, Bosnia. She has spoken at many prestigious forums, and we feel happy to be her audience today. The jury for the Nobel Prize praised Louise Gluck for her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes individual existence universal. Dr. Bhumika will talk about that unmistakable poetic voice. Welcome, Dr. Bhumika. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamani. It's definitely a wonderful opportunity for me to speak on Louise Gluck, the great poet, today on this platform, that LTI platform, which is a very renowned platform there across India, in fact outside and abroad also. I would like to share my slides. Yeah, thank you so much. As Dr. Kamani has pointed out, that today I would be focusing more on the unmistakable poetic voice, because that is a very specific quality which is pointed out specifically by the panel when such an award was basically bestowed upon Louise Gluck. My co-panelist, Dr. S. Gururaj, has already introduced the poet very elaborately, and he has mentioned the works which she has produced, which has, of course, international acclaim, and her name now doesn't require any introduction further. So I would be focusing on her poetic quality that actually classifies her poetry or her poetic style as, an unmistakable voice that perhaps nobody can miss, because it has so much intensity, it has such grace, it has such a wonderful lyrical quality that nobody can just miss out that perhaps I should say that charm which lies there in the poetry itself as a genre. Her poetry is known and is appreciated for her technical precision, the sensitivity which is writ large in her poems, that insight into loneliness which every human being can connect to, because it comes out of heart and it gets connected with the universe. So this connection between the personal and the universe, that has been a great quality which great poets have always used in their expressions, and American literary tradition itself has been an example of that. So we can place Louise Gluck in the tradition of American literature, and if we see in terms of the women writers, although she has passed gender and she has passed, the national boundaries, but still if we connect her to that American literary tradition and the women poet, then we would find that she perhaps somewhere can be located in the tradition of Emily Dickinson, who was an early 19th century in America, and then the contemporary, that is the 20th century poet Sylvia Plath. So we have, somewhere this tradition which is being carried forward by Louise Gluck. Major themes which she has touched upon is like family relationship, death, mortality, and that universal connection, the spiritual awakening, that enlightenment. All these are wonderfully presented by her in her unmistakable poetic voice. So this is something that makes her poetic voice unmistakable, that is how she extends that individual to universal, how she converts her personal her poetic quality got intensified, and then we have its reflection in her literary journey, in her poetic journey that starts from her early anthologies to the latest one, like The Faithful and Virtuous Night, that is the latest collection. So let me read from the earlier collection, The Wild Iris, which was published in 1992. In this anthology, we find that all poems are spoken by flowers. We have the voices. And one of the critics has very nicely pointed out once that how Louise Group writes, she actually gives you the voices. So you can see that there are characters around which she builds her poetic world. And these are not just the characters, they are actually the voices. And these voices bring out the dialectics of life. They bring out the contrariness and the contradictions of life. These voices bring out the intensity of the life as lived by us. And around that, she builds her poetry, and then we come out with experiences that speak for themselves. So there is a poetic persona, there is a poetic voice which is speaking, but we can very conveniently, very easily, very comfortably connect to that voice, can understand the dialectics. As it is stated that there is some kind of emotional intensity that charms you, that allures you, that takes you, along poetry actually demonstrates that. So this is the poem drawn from the White Iris. So this is the poem drawn from the White Iris, where the speaker is the red poppy, the flower. I'll read out. The great thing is not having a mind. Feelings, oh, I have those. They govern me. I have a Lord in heaven called the sun, and open for him, showing him the fire of my own heart, fire like his presence. What could such glory be? Not a heart. Oh, my brothers and sisters, were you like me once, long ago, before you were human? Did you permit yourselves to open once who would never open again? Because in truth, I'm speaking now the way you do. I speak because I'm shattered. So here we have the speaker, that is a red poppy, that is a flower, and that is making connection with the sun, the Lord, which is present in the sky. Now this red poppy is made to bloom. It opens when the sunlight falls upon it. And when it opens, it would like to show its heart to the sun. This is the connection between that object that lies in the nature on earth, and then the divinity which is exhibited in that rays which are coming out of the sun. So this is the connection. This is the spiritual or divine element that is connecting one natural object with somewhere in the ethereal world, something which is there on the earth and something which is there in the sky. So the red poppy opens its heart and then shows it to the sun, and the sun can see that energy, that power, that intensity. So this is the emotional intensity that enables an earthly object to connect to the universe, to connect to a divine power which is lying above. So this way you can see that how the personal experience, why I'm saying personal experience, because you can see it's a first person voice, I, the speaker. And in most of the blues poetry, you would find that there is one I. Now this I takes a shape. When it becomes a voice, it can be a mythological character, it can be a person, the speaker, the poet oneself, or it may be some object, which is actually the image drawn from the poem itself. So this is, the glimpse of her early poetry, because in her later poetry, we find longer poems, which she calls book-length narratives. See, there's wonderful thing to understand here, to, note down here, book-length narratives. The first thing, book-length, they becomes longer, because Gluck says that in the beginning when she wrote 15 lines, and then she thought perhaps whatever she wanted to say, she had already said. But as she continues her poetic journey, then she realizes that this one voice is not suffice. She needs the answer, because the voice actually poses questions, and then there is a need to answer to that voice. So there is a craving not showing. Yeah. I think I have missed one slide. Anyways, I let's go ahead with this. The myth of innocence, because there is another poem from the White Iris in which we have another speaker, that is the blue flower, the White Iris, and in that poem, the poet is actually talking about her crossing the boundary and entering into the domain of death, the darkness, the stillness that enlightens her, that again, gives you the idea of the rebirth, and how it is possible to, enter into the darkness, that mysticism, and come back. So as that poem was not visible on the slide, so I am just giving you the gist of it. So the journey continues, as I have, pointed out two poems from the collection Wild Iris. Now I'm coming to her comparatively later collection, that is Averno. It has a lot of mythological references, mythological characters, but as my co-panelist, Dr. Vanna, would be talking about the mythological dimension of her poetry, that's why I would not focus on this mythological dimension, but I would like to tell you that how she addresses various themes in her poetry, where she includes these mythological characters. Because again, these mythological characters are the voices, and we find that they are individuals, but then they are placed in the social context, and these social contexts make the person realize the inner relationship, the relationship with the self, that makes Louis Gluck's poetry quite deep, and then the social context which connect the person with the outer world. So let me read out one excerpt from The Myth of Innocence, which is drawn from the Averno. So it's a long poem, so I'm not reading out the entire poem, I'm just reading out one extract. Here the situation which is created by the poet in this particular poem is that we have this mythological character of Proserpine. Now she is coming back and standing beside the pool, and she's looking at the pool, and then she starts thinking about that. When I read the starting line, I think you yourself can trace that dialectic which I'm talking about, which is so much frequent in Gluck's poetry. See, Proserpine is the person, the speaker, the voice which features in this poem, and she stands by the pool. So that is the situation created. I'll read. She stands by the pool saying, "From time to time, I was abducted." But it sounds wrong to her. Nothing like what she felt. Then she says, "I was not abducted." Then she says, "I offered myself. I wanted to escape my body. Even sometimes I will this." But ignorance cannot will knowledge. Ignorance wills something imagined, which it believes exists. All the different nouns, she says them in rotation. Dead, husband, God, stranger. Everything sounds so simple, so conventional. I must have been, she thinks, a simple girl. She can't remember herself as a person, but she keeps thinking the fool will remember and explain to her the meaning of her prayer, so she can understand whether it was answered or not. In this extract, you can see that the poetic voice, the Proserpine and the character, she is referring to her dilemma, the dialectics, the contrariness which she experiences. She feels she was abducted, and then she comes with the counterpoint that she was not abducted, she offered herself. So this is basically the ambivalence or the dilemma that constitutes the life experiences of the human beings. We all, and that's why the Gluck's poetic thought becomes universal. There's a kind of movement shift from the personal to the universal. So this is the dialectic which is evoked there in this particular stanza, and we find that what actually this voice is thinking about, Proserpine is thinking about. She is thinking about the innocence which she has lost, because that relates to her childhood. So when she's standing at the pool and she's thinking about the past, the childhood when she was such a simple girl, and then the present time when she is abducted by the Hades, that is, of course, who took her along with him, and
interrupt you.
Yeah.
We need to give some time to the
Okay.
third speaker, so we'll need you to wind up. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So then I'll just read this last excerpt that is titled as A Foreshortened Journey. Why I'm reading it? Because that will again show you that how she shifted from the lyrical poems to the prose poems. I'll just read it out. I found the stairs somewhat more difficult than I had expected, and so I sat down, so to speak, in the middle of the journey, because there was a large window opposite the railing. I was able to entertain myself with the little dramas and comedies of the street outside, though no one I knew passed by, no one, certainly, who could have assisted me, nor were the stairs themselves in use as far as I could see. You must get up, my lad, I told myself. Since this seemed suddenly impossible, I did the next best thing. I prepared to sleep. My head and arms on the stair above, my body crouched below. Sometimes after this, a little girl appeared at the top of the staircase, holding the hand of an elderly woman. Grandmother, cried the little girl, there's a dead man on the staircase. We must let him sleep, said the grandmother. We must walk quietly by. He's at that point in life at which neither returning to the beginning nor advancing to the end seems bearable. Therefore, he has decided to stop, here in the midst of the things, though this makes him an obstacle to others such as ourselves. But we must not give up hope in my own life, she continued. There was such a time, though that was long ago. And here she let her grandmother walk in front of her so they could pass me without disturbing me. I would have liked to hear the whole of her story when she seemed, as she passed by, a vigorous woman, ready to take pleasure in life, and at the same time forthright, without illusions. But soon their voices faded into whispers, or they were far away. Will we see him when we return? The child murmured. He will be long gone by then, said her grandmother. He will have finished climbing up or down as the case may be. Then I'll say goodbye now, said the girl, and she knelt below me, chanting a prayer I recognize as the Hebrew prayer for the dead. Sir, she whispered, my grandmother tells me you're not dead, but I thought perhaps this would soothe you in your terrors, and I will not be here to sing it at the right time. When you hear this again, she said, perhaps the words will be less intimidating if you remember how you first heard them in the voice of a slave girl. So this is the extract drawn from Faithful and Virtuous Night, and this is an example of a prose poem where she becomes more subtle in, giving you the depth of the life, its experiences, as she says, the foreshortened journey. So I'll just conclude as, we have limited time. So I would say in brief that her poetic themes includes trauma, survival. She comments on the opinion and she gives explanation about the event, expresses desire. There is nature imagery used by her. There is autobiographical element used by her. There is a sense of in-between there. There is sense of spiritual witnessing, which she shows in her poems. And her poetic style is marked with the careful dissection, the rhythm, the autobiographical element, and the psychoanalysis where the self listens to what it is left into the dreams and illusions. So we have the unmistakable poetic voice which has very candid and uncompromising tone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Bhumika. I'm so sorry that time is always a limitation. I'm so sorry. Next, we have Dr. Vandana Sharma, who's an associate professor and head Department of English, Central University of Jammu. Her interest chiefly lies in translation studies, gender studies, post-colonial writing, and Indian English literature. She has presented papers in numerous national and international conferences and has published 5 important books. Some of them are translations from Dogri to English. Her translation of Sahitya Academy awarded short stories Dudh Lahu Zeher has been published by Sahitya Academy New Delhi, entitled Waiting for Neelkant and Other Stories. I'm not going to go into a very elaborate introduction because that will eat into her time. I think I should just welcome her and ask her to take the stage from here. Dr. Vandana Sharma.
Thank you so much, Dr. Damiani. It's indeed a pleasure to be here at this stellar platform, I must say, and to be speaking on a writer, of this depth, profundity, and magnitude, Louis Gleek. So I'm glad that being the last speaker, I have the privilege. I can skip on certain points. I can carry forward. My co-panelists, they have already deliberated over her thematic concerns, on her biography at the same time. And here I am. And I would like to begin and carry forward, as Dr. Bhumika just mentioned, Louis Gleek's unmistakable poetic voice. And what is important is the beauty with which she makes the individual experience universal. And my all compliments to the LTI webinar series for taking up this author, because as Dr. Raj also mentioned, and we understand that to be deliberating and discussing a writer who has been awarded Nobel Prize just a couple of months back is indeed a great pleasure and privilege. I would just touch upon Louis Gleek's oeuvre. Faithful and Virtuous Night has already been talked about, has already been deliberated by Dr. Bhumika, and as we know that by this time that Louis Gleek's oeuvre comprises of 12 books of poetry, including the recent collection, which is Faithful and the Virtuous Night, which has been awarded National Book Award and poems from 1962 to 2012. In nutshell, we can see that Louis Gleek's poems, such as The Firstborn, The House on Marshland, The Garden, Descending Figure, The Triumph of Achilles, Ararat, and the Pulitzer Prize winning The Wild Iris, which has been read by Dr. Bhumika. However, since I'm going to look at the mythological undercurrents in the poetry of Louis Gleek, I would be looking at two of her most important poems, which is Meadowlands and Averno. Daniel Morris traces the wide range of Gleek's poetry when he says, from the persona poem to a blunt confessionalism to dialogue to a kind of mock epic that, like Joyce's Ulysses, regards the author's life, however, ironized through a Homeric template, because she composes her poetry from a mosaic of multicultural resources. Gleek has appealed to critics representing diverse, often diametrically opposed communities of interpretation. What's interesting to note is that Gleek's revisionist myth-making, because poetry has always been a handmaiden of mythology and vice versa. Sometimes poets are in the business of collecting and tweaking existing myths, as with Ovid's Metamorphoses and Poetic Edda. Other times poetry applies a mythological glamour to stories and characters from history, legend, or even myths for that matter. So it is interesting to note that the relationship between poetry and mythology is central to Louis Gleek's, and no poet of Gleek's generation has relied so heavily, so overtly on mythology as Philip Larkin once called the common myth-eating. So that's probably inevitable because Gleek has always favored abstraction over particularity from the beginning. She has written lines that are almost completely devoid of the kind of chatty reportage and pop cultural name dropping that have been very common in American poetry. First of all, I will touch upon, I'll shortly dwell over the mythic to the modern in Meadowlands. Meadowlands as a collection, here Louis Gleek in Meadowland explores the shaky marital landscape that her earlier work, The Wild Iris, addressed. The book-length sequence juxtaposes, reinterprets, and illuminates an array of voices, both contemporary and epic, by interweaving them together throughout the collection. The backdrop for the sequence is Homer's Odyssey, where evocations of the story of Penelope and Odysseus shadow the breakup of a contemporary divorcing couple. Penelope in Greek mythology is celebrated for her faithfulness, for her patience, and for her feminine virtue, and is the most enduring version of Greek myth. Circe, on the other hand, in Meadowlands, is a sequence and a series of parables. So Gleek intertwines these small series rather than clustering each group in complete linear threads, so that each of the perspectives are constantly responding to and expounding on each other. In addition to these sequences found within the larger work, Gleek includes a series of kitchen sink dialogue poems and epistles written in the voices of contemporary husband and wife that are also woven around the mythic speakers. Now here I would like to look at the 2 poems from this collection of Meadowlands, White Evening and Purple Bathing Suit. The feminine perspective is divided among Circe and Saturn as the other woman, contrasted with the opposing forces of Penelope and the modern woman as the wife. The masculine perspective of the husband in regard to this departure and the infidelities is chiefly reflected in the parallel she draws between contemporary husband and Odysseus. But the Thalimeches mini-sequence also provides a very unique outlook on the question of marriage and a falling relationship in his account of the parents. There is no formal pattern that Gleek uses when ordering these poems, but she's certainly within the loose boundaries of the implied narrative, makes use of a general progression of the poems as a cohesive unit, moving from the apprehension and raw hostility of the earlier poems to the final poems that eventually come to acceptance.
Indian event চলতেছে
Now, Quiet Evening,
India
one of the
event
opening
link
poems,
দিছিলেন যে
where
রেজিস্ট্রেশন
Gleek
করছে
writes in the voice of the wife in an epistle to her husband, saying, from this point on, the silence through which you move is my voice
753 জন আছে এখন
pursuing you. This hostile warning reveals the speaker's anxiety and distrustfulness toward her husband's departure, even though she never vocalizes her emotions in the poem. And much later, in the sequence of the purple bathing suit, the speaker again addresses her husband in an epistle. But this time, instead of hiding her own fears with a thinly veiled thread to make herself feel better, she shows signs of self-recognition through a moment of honesty, admitting to herself, as much as she wants her freedom from her husband, she's very much dependent on him at the same time. When she says, you are a small, irritating purple thing, and I would like to see you walk off the face of the earth, because you are all that's wrong with my life, and I need you, and I claim you. As we move on, most of the last few poems in the sequence, namely The Dream, Otis, Heart's Desire, The Wish, Parable of Gift. So here the speaker's movement towards the acceptance of the marriage's end. Alongside these poems are The Wish, Parable of the Gift, which both concern finding personal happiness. And I think that these 2 threads running side by side is appropriate, because for the speaker, the recognition and acceptance brings a sense of peace, freedom in knowing that affection will triumph over passion. Now, for instance, a departure. Departure, one of the epistles written in the voice of the contemporary wife to her husband, is directly followed by Ithaka, a poem written choice that provides a more impersonal, distant account of the epic narrative. Departure presents a situation where the husband is leaving home, his destination unknown to the reader, and his wife is apprehensive about him being gone. Now, the poem shows the speaker's honest realism when presenting the complexities of the situation. She also shows a side of a last denial in wishing that her husband would just stay away with her a little longer, even though she's already adept at avoiding the heart. And Ithaka directly responds to this. The beloved doesn't need to live. The beloved lives in the head. So what we see here is that now the speaker claims that what she will remember from his departure is her husband's hands on the back of the chair. We know he will permeate her through thoughts. Now whether they are nostalgic thoughts or parallels of Penelope's hypothesis, her husband's erotic life, it's not clarified here. Now as we move on, it's very interesting to see.
We need some questions to be answered.
Okay.
If you could, because we're already out of time.
Okay, so what I can do is that
we need to wind up.
I'll quickly in 2 minutes. So, Circe and Penelope, that's another very interesting twist, interesting, myth-making technique which she has employed in this poem is also very interesting to see. And as we move on to the mythological undercurrents in Averno, that becomes all the more important to see, because I will just run through my presentation because as I said earlier also that the quote of this, depth cannot be told, but it's really compliments to Eltine. They have organized this webinar. So the myth of innocence is another where the story of Persephone and Hades and several of the major themes including love, disappointment, they have been taken up. And moving on to the myth of devotion, which is a complex story that shows the comparison, the idea of love rather than the love for someone or something. So where she makes use of darkness as a representation of love and freedom. So as we move towards the conclusion, it is very important to realize and understand that we are living in quite unprecedented times, and it's really challenging to deliberate over the profundity, as I said, of Gleig's poetic genius. And what we realize is that as the world battles a stubborn pandemic, the Swedish Academy's pick is perhaps a reminder that amid mind-numbing uncertainties, there is art. And as is reflected for Miss Gleig, as she said in one of her interviews in New York Times, I would like to conclude with that. The hope is that if you live through it, there will be art on the other side. There is an awakening after darkness, she appears to say in Snowdrops. And with this, we end, and we hope that the world comes out of the present darkness which all of us are engulfed in one form or the other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I now request Dr. Anita Sharma, who's President LTI Simla chapter, to take us through the questions and also conclude the session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamaini, and it was really a wonderful session with Dr. Gururaj, Dr. Bhumika Sharma, and Dr. Vandana Sharma, ma'am. We regret, for the time limit which we had. Your discourses were so wonderful. It was not really, good to actually interrupt in between, but somehow we had to due to the time constraint. I think all the three speakers, they had actually talked about in detail about Jew's Elizabeth Gleig, poetry, and for which she has been given Nobel Prize. I will just try to summarize whatever they said in one or two paragraphs. That is, as they have told us that Gleig is one of the America's most talented contemporary poets who has won 2020 Nobel Prize in Literature, whose judges actually has praised her unmistakable poetic voice that in austere beauty makes individual existence universal. And that is the thing, where we find in her poetry the technical precision and sensitivity, insight into her loneliness, her family relationships, divorce and death, which I think even Dr. Gururaj sir has also talked. Her later work really continues, and they explore the agony of the self, which I think Vandana ma'am and Bhumika ma'am, they had tried to touch in their discourse. In her poems, the self listens actually uh, what is left of its dreams and delusions, and nobody can be harder than she is in confronting the illusions of the self. She also talks about the voices of mythological concerns like Dido, Persephone, Eurydice, even Homer and others, which Ma'am Vandana has talked. The abandoned, the punished, the betrayed, which actually stand for the mask for the self in transformation in personal as well as on the universal scale. Glick is often described as an autobiographical poet or a confessional poet also due to her emotional intensity, and because she is often drawing her things from mythology or nature imagery, because she is actually meditating in a personal experience and with her modern life. A teacher of English at Yale University, Miss Glick has said that from poet Stanley Kunitz, she learned to subordinate her ego to the needs of the poem. The poet uh, Crack has described her as a writer for whom words are always scarce, hard won, and not to be wasted. And that's where she is having that lyrical compression which could bring her close to Emily Dickinson, to Elizabeth Bishop in American poetry. Her relationship between life and death in her poetry actually talks about one important theme, that is desire. I think a generation after Walt Whitman, if we say, that declared, himself as the poet of the body and the poet of the soul, Glick too uncovers that spirit which is woven of sinew and the mind of the marrow. And she also talks about the emotional, trauma, the consciousness, and without which she feels there is nothing. And yet, she says, we spend our lives turning away from this elemental fact with distraction, with addiction, and with the sense of dizziness until suddenly something beyond our control, a diagnosis, a heart attack, or a pandemic that staggers us away. So talking about this process, Miss Glick said she feels alive when she writes poetry. For her, writing is a kind of revenge against circumstances, as told by Dr. Gururaj sir, because she had gone through all the bad luck, loss, and pain during her teenage years. As the world today battles a stubborn pandemic COVID-19, as Kamani had began her discourse in the beginning, I think the Swedish Academy's pick is perhaps a reminder that amidst mind-numbing uncertainties due to COVID, there is art with poetry. And when there is art, there is hope. So I think more of the thing I would like to conclude with her two quotations. One, which ma'am has also talked about, Bhumika ma'am. The great thing is not having a mind. Feeling, oh, I have those, and they govern me. And the another quote is, the unsaid to be exerts great
Hmm.
power. I think with this uh, scenario of the poet, and the discourses we had from Dr. Bhumika Sharma ma'am and Dr. Vandana, as well as Dr. Gurraj, we had actually gone through her poetry. We had elaborate discourses on her biographical, academic, as well as the mythological world. Now I think let's come to the question answer session, and there are for all the three speakers, we have compliments. The chat box is full of compliments. A wonderful session, and people are thanking you all. Thank you so much to the wonderful speakers. And because we are not comfortable with the time thing, so according to Javier, I must take up only few questions. And the questions are actually to all the three speakers. There is the first question which I have got on my WhatsApp now. Javier has forwarded it to me. Can we say that her poetic topics are close to Adrienne Rich? The question is by Dr. Sujita Sandhu.
Yeah, I have already answered that question under public chat. Yes, they are almost very close, and not only to Adrienne Rich, but her poems are very much closer to Kamala Das or any other sensible writer who relies on real life experiences and facts of life.
There is another question by Uday Sankar Chaudhary sir, and he is asking what is the impact of Greek mythology on our poets? I think Dr. Van elaborated a lot on that. In fact, even in a limited time span. Dr. Vandana, would you like to answer this one?
Absolutely. It's really, I was flabbergasted at the fact, as I was going through the poetic compositions of Louis Clique, I found that there have been not only the Greek mythology, even Roman mythology for that matter. So, majority of her poems, whether it is Abono, because due to paucity of time, I could just touch upon her major poetic compositions. So we find that there is very prominent, intermingling of the poetic and the mythic in her poetry, whether it is in Abono, whether it is the myth of Penelope and Hades, whether it is a myth from the Odysseus, right? So it's very interesting to see, and one can draw various she places the mythic and the modern. That juxtaposition of the mythic and the modern is very, very predominant in the poetic compositions of Louis Clique.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have the last question now to all the speakers. Why is only her voice considered to be the unmistakable poetic voice when there are many other equally deserving of
Could you again read it because I couldn't get the entire thing?
This is why is only her voice considered to be unmistakable poetic voice. Sorry. When there are many others who are equally deserving of that description.
Okay. So I would like to, respond to this very, very interesting query that way. Actually, it makes the, you can say, choice quite difficult for the panel or for the group of the people who are responsible for making a decision, especially with regards to the Nobel Prize. But, I would say that art has its own charm and its intensity and its strength. It allures you, it drives you towards your, oneself, and then you would realize that there is something, maybe if I call it an X factor, so this unmistakable X factor, perhaps if I say it in the contemporary language, or I would say that emotional intensity and that artistic element, when they are combined, although we cannot be the judge in a way, but the art manifests its strength for its excellence. You must have heard about the touchstone method which Arnold suggested at one point of time. So there is something like the touchstone that would tell you, that beauty of the work that perhaps makes it quite rewarding. And I don't doubt about the decision of the panel who decided to award her Nobel Prize, because when I went to her poetry, there is no doubt about it that it mesmerizes. And that's why perhaps, the jury must have stated the unmistakable voice. It makes you listen. Even if you don't want to, still it will allure you towards that. So there are many other talented writers also, but Louis Clique is no lesser than that. So in that case, I would see the element which is there, that art, that beauty, that intensity, that has capacity to make everybody connect to it and then learn the depth of life in such precision, in using such economy of word and then giving the greater truth. That is so wonderful in her writing that perhaps the jury must have decided not to, miss that, and that's why she becomes an unmistakable voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you to all the speakers. Now, let me propose a formal thanks. Altai Shimla chapter, on behalf of Altai Shimla chapter, we are really very grateful and full of gratitude to the President of Altai, Professor Sanjay Arora, sir, for giving us this opportunity and this platform. My heartfelt thanks to all our eminent speakers, Dr. Gururaj S., Dr. Bhumika Sharma, and Dr. Vandana Sharma. And my special thanks to the moderator, ma'am, Dr. Kamaini. I'm also grateful to the director of the webinar, Dr. Mohan Raj sir, who was with us and who has to lead the meeting. And especially to our technical expert, without whom it wouldn't have been possible, Dr. Javier. Thank you so much. And also, in the last is all the office bearers and the members of the LTI, especially Professor Shravan, Professor Ramani, Professor Ilango. We are thankful to you all. And my special thanks to all the participants and all those people who actually raised queries and they actually participated into the discussion. Thank you so much, friends, to be with us. And I'm happy to share with you all that we had international participants also with us. I found chats coming up and giving up the compliments from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Indonesia, and some other countries also. Thank you so much, friends, for joining us over here. Now, on behalf of LSI, we have certain announcements which are to be presented for our future endeavors. Allow me to share those. I hope Javier are going to help me with that. Thank you so much. Our next webinar will be held at 4:30 p.m. IST on 6th December on the topic Teaching Poetry Effectively by Dr. Partha Sarthi Mishra, Faculty Azim Premji University, Bengaluru. The registration link is available in the chat box. Regional English Language Office, Relo, New Delhi brings you a unique opportunity of attending and Facebook live event on the comprehension hypothesis 45 years later. But the renowned subject expert, Dr. Stephen Vishen, joined the Facebook live session at 5 p.m. IST on November 23. The link to Relo's Facebook page is available in the chat box. From 20th December 2020 onwards, we will issue certificates of participation only to the members of LSI who attend our webinars. However, our webinars will continue to be open for anyone to attend without any registration fee. If you are not a member of LSI, we request you to take membership as soon as possible. Your membership will enable us to conduct more professional development programs in the future. The link to membership form is available in the chat box. So these are the announcements on behalf of LSI, English Language Teachers Association of India. We're all thankful to you all. Thank you so much and goodbye, good evening to all of you.